In 2020, the Genealogical Forum of Oregon, also known as GFO, asked me to make a presentation on the research I had done on my second great maternal grandfather, John Spillan. He was the first person on my maternal side that I know of who first came to the U.S. from Ireland around 1858. I wanted to recreate my presentation to make it available to those who've asked to see it. I'll share some compelling stories I've uncovered about John's fascinating life and the mysteries surrounding him that I still want to know. You're looking at John's signature on this slide. It's the only personal artifact of him that I have. I'm still looking for a photo of him. This signature is from his petition for naturalization in 1868. This is the document that led me down the rabbit hole in my search for John's stories. It's his death certificate from 1906 in Pennsylvania. His death certificate states that John died in the State Hospital for the Insane and was there for almost 10 years. When I saw that, I experienced all kinds of emotions. I wondered what that meant to me and my family, what kind of mental illness he might have had, how severe it was, and had he passed on that mental illness to others in my family. No one in my family ever talked about John's stay in the State Hospital for the Insane. This cold, hard fact drove me to want to dig deeper into his story. Before I start with John's story, let me first introduce myself. I'm Patricia Delick. My maternal family came from Ireland, and my paternal family came from Eastern Europe. When my mother died in 2013, I began researching my family's genealogy. I didn't want more stories to get lost. This is my grandfather, James Spillan. Of all the people in my family, I felt closest to him because he was kind and generous. My grandfather changed my life when I was in the 7th grade. He discovered I was nearsighted and needed glasses, which led me to my first pair of glasses. Suddenly, I was able to do much better in school because I could finally see what the teacher was writing on the blackboard. He also bought me a Steinway piano when I was studying music in college. James was renowned in the Philadelphia area for advertising. The 1920 census lists that he was an ad man at the electric company. Here I am as an infant with my grandfather in 1956. And here I am in the 1970s as a teenager. This is the only other photo I have of me with my grandfather. Here's my grandfather and grandmother in 1924 when they got married in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was 31 years old. In 1917, James served as a first lieutenant in World War I in France when he was 24. Here's a painting of him in his World War I Army uniform. He commissioned this painting a few decades after the war ended. My older sister still has it, and it's a family heirloom. James never spoke about his time in World War I. I would love to know more about his experience in the war. He received an honorable discharge in 1919. My grandfather was John Spillan's grandson. Learning where my grandfather came from was one of my main motivations to dig deep into his grandfather John's story. I always wondered where my grandfather's sense of generosity came from. Did he inherit it from his family? Here's 3 generations of Spillans. From left to right is my grandfather, my uncle, and my great-grandfather. This photo was taken in the late 1920s in Philadelphia. This graphic shows my ancestral link to John Spillan. As I mentioned before, John Spillan is my second great maternal grandfather. I found 9 children that John and his wife Margaret had. My great-grandfather was William, second born and first son. Like many others who are into genealogy, I met John through his death certificate. One of the first errors I noticed was that his last name was misspelled. They spelled his last name with an E instead of an A. When I noticed where he died, I wanted to know why he was in the state hospital for the insane. Here's another error I found. He was widowed, not married. His wife Margaret died in 1880 and he died in 1906. His birth year shown is one of many different years on various official documents. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use his birth year shown here, 1837, for this presentation. One of the frustrating things about searching where in Ireland my Irish ancestors are from is that many official documents I've found only list Ireland with no county or town. His death certificate also states that both his parents are from Ireland. I started my research looking for John's birth date and place, who his parents were, when he came to the U.S., and where and when he got married. I'm sure anyone who does genealogy research runs into this problem, conflicting information on official documents. On this slide, you can see the conflicting information I found for his birthplace and year. Most official documents list Ireland, although I've also seen England mentioned as his birthplace on others. His birth year ranges from 1827 to 1842. Through my research, I found 5 clues that John may be from County Cork. Here's clue number 1. I started by searching for counties where the last name Spillan was most common. I found this book, Families of County Cork, in the GFO library. When you look for your relatives, be sure to search for alternative last name spellings. I've seen John occasionally spell his last name ending with an E. I believe he may have Americanized his last name by taking off the E. Here's clue number 2. If you have a free account on archive.org, you can access the Book of Irish Families Great and Small at no cost. I was able to find the name Spillan. The highlighted counties on this map are where the name Spillan was found. Cork was listed with the highest numbers for the name Spillan. Here's clue number 3. My ethnicity estimate places me in Ireland's southern counties. Notice on this slide that Ancestry.com is telling me they found 2 possible ancestor stories. Those were my stories. Here's clue number 4. This report of 1890 birth indices by Robert Matheson shows that the largest number of Spillan families lived in County Cork. Munster shows 42 birth entries in 1890. Munster is a province in the southwest of Ireland where County Cork is located. According to John's petition for naturalization, he left Ireland in 1858, which is before this report was created. Here's clue number 5. Since County Cork seemed like a very high probability, I joined Facebook's County Cork surname matchfinder group to see if I could find any distant cousins. I did find a distant cousin, and we had a GED match. She told me her Spillan ancestors were from Ahada in County Cork. If you're not familiar with GED Match, it's an online service comparing DNA files with others. I'm still thinking that County Cork is one of the top contenders. Additional clues are from John Grenham's Find a Surname that ties the name Spillan to County Cork. Griffith's valuation also showed numerous Spillan households in the mid-19th century. Even with all the clues I found that lead to John being born in County Cork, I still would like to have definitive documentation that shows he is from Cork. Knowing where he's from would give me a personal connection to a place in Ireland and an understanding of the conditions why he left to go to the U.S. I would love to visit his hometown to find my Spillan roots. Doesn't every research project have detours and corrections? The Irish Ancestry Group at GFO helped me correct errors and also gave me some intriguing leads. When I first started my research, I was so excited when I found John Spillan in Massachusetts Irish Regiment on the Union side, fighting in the Civil War. I kept looking at all these faces and thought, my John is one of these men. And then I found John Spillan's naturalization papers, giving his birth date and place, showing he was from County Cork. I was so excited. Then I found out I had the wrong John. And unfortunately, I had put all this data on my Ancestry.com tree. I've since removed all the wrong information, but this error still persists. Others had copied it into their trees. I then started working with GFO researcher Nancy Remington. I told her I was willing to be wrong and asked her to shoot holes in my data. She helped me right my wrongs. She found data confirming that was not my John fighting in the Civil War, and those weren't his naturalization papers. And earlier, I had also incorrectly identified John's parents. This is how Nancy documented her findings. Her goal was to find John's parents and his birthplace. One day, while Nancy and I were working together at GFO, we had a really big find. We found John's marriage certificate. This document also gave us his wife Margaret's maiden name, which was Allen. The witnesses Jacob and Joanna might be related to Margaret. I had found a transcription of Margaret's baptismal record in Ireland, and her mother's last name was listed as Shea. To help my search for John's birthplace in Ireland, I thought his children's baptismal records might list John's birthplace. I contacted Holy Infancy, the church he attended in South Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Holy Infancy found 3 of John's children who were born in South Bethlehem. They are the ones highlighted on the bottom: Kathleen, Cornelius, and James. Unfortunately, the baptismal records had no location information for John, and the church wouldn't send me an image of the original records. I also attended an Irish ancestry group meeting at GFO and told them about my brick wall of not being able to find where in Ireland John was from. They weren't able to help me with that, but what happened instead was a huge bombshell. One of the group members had done some research on John. During the meeting, she casually turned to me and asked, "Have you seen this article?" Irish ancestry group member Joanne Taylor found this article, which helped tie together some stories about John. It's from the newspaper in Philadelphia called The Times on August 23, 1885. A tax collector in trouble. Special dispatch to The Times. Easton, August 22nd. John Spillan has been committed to jail here on a charge of embezzlement as school tax collector in the 3rd Ward, South Bethlehem. His account is $280 short, and his bondsmen Patrick Donahue, Jeremiah Gardner, and Lawrence Curry have been called to make good the deficiency. Spillan fled, but was caught in Philadelphia. He was constable and county tax collector in his ward. Not only did I learn that John had committed a crime, but I also learned about one of his jobs. He was the school tax collector for his ward. I wonder who took care of his children while he was in prison. John's wife Margaret had died 5 years before he went to prison. On this map, you can see the distance from Easton, where the prison was, and Bethlehem, where his family lived. I also found a drawing of the prison. It was built in 1868 through 1871. The prison was relatively new when John was there. When Margaret died, John became a single parent of 5 children under the age of 18. Maybe he committed the crime out of desperation to take care of his children. Here's the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus John Spillan docket. John was indicted for embezzlement. He was in prison for 6 months. Here's his prison record. And here's a close-up of the top section of his prison record. It states he was 52 years old in 1885. That would make his birth year around 1833. Why did he list that he was a native of England? Maybe he thought he might be in better standing in prison if he was from England instead of Ireland. His age doesn't seem right either. Here's the bottom part of his prison record. I'm not sure what "no" means for parents. This document states that John could read, write, and is temperate. His prison record lists him as being married. John's wife died 5 years prior, so this is incorrect. I learned from this document that he didn't own property. His sentencing information is listed: 6 months and a $239 fine. Dates he was sentenced and received are listed. I learned that John went to public school and left school at 14. I also learned he did not serve in the Army. This news article from January 1891 shows more trouble with the law, which happened 5 years after he left prison. It's from the Allentown, Pennsylvania paper, The Critic. His case, John Spillan versus Michael O'Connell, is one of 63 cases on Lehigh criminals' list to be tried. A week later, in the same newspaper, this article lists the sentences imposed by the judge. Michael O'Connell was put under a $100 bail to keep the peace towards John. Michael also had to pay for the costs. I wonder what kind of scuffle they got into. The upside of John being in prison is that they had John's petition for naturalization and sent it to me. Through this document, I learned that when he arrived in the U.S., he was a minor under the age of 18. That brings more questions. Why did he leave as a minor? These are the findings from his 1868 petition for naturalization I found most interesting. He was listed as being 26 in 1868, which would make his birth year around 1842. Here's yet another birth year for John. This official document lists Ireland as his birthplace, but unfortunately no county or town is listed. He was a minor under 18 when he arrived in the U.S. in July 1858. This document confirms the year when he immigrated. He intended to settle in Northampton County. He immigrated from Liverpool. On this map, you can see the distance from Easton, where he was imprisoned, to Bethlehem. I'm guessing it was probably difficult for his family to visit John when he was in prison. You can also see the distance from Bethlehem to Philadelphia, where he fled after his crime. Since John lived in Philadelphia before moving his family to South Bethlehem, he probably knew people who lived there. That's where he married Margaret before moving to South Bethlehem. I'll talk more about his stay in Norristown later. Speaking of Margaret, who was John's wife, I found her headstone in St. Michael's Cemetery in August 2015 when I met up with distant cousins who are into genealogy. Finding her headstone was a huge score. It listed not just the county, but also the town where she was from. But I did not find John's headstone. In the photo on the right, I'm kneeling in front of her headstone with my cousin Kate by my side. Here's the transcription of Margaret's headstone. Margaret, wife of John Spillan. Born in Ballynageard, County Limerick, May 12, 1837. Died January 6, 1880. This is the famous 1935 Walker Evans photograph of St. Michael's Cemetery. In the background of the cemetery, there's a row of family houses. Beyond the houses is the steel mill, where many people worked. This photo shows South Bethlehem was a working-class town. This present-day photo depicts the life cycle of immigrants from the steel mill to home to St. Michael's Cemetery. Scott Singer took this photo, and it was sent to me by Rosemary Buffington, a prominent Bethlehem researcher. I've compiled this list of the work John did to support his family. When he first arrived in the U.S., John started out as a laborer. I'm guessing that working as a laborer was a very typical job new male immigrants did. Later, John became a saloon keeper and then a constable and county tax collector. After he got out of prison, he was listed again as being a laborer. He was around 53 years old. His death certificate indicates he was a shoemaker at the end of his life. John experienced yet another big disaster, which I see as the beginning of the end for him. 10 years after getting out of prison, John was struck by a train. This news article from the Allentown Daily Leader on November 17, 1896 tells the story. Struck by an engine. John Spillan, an old and well-known resident of Bethlehem, was struck by an engine on the North Penn Railroad at the East 3rd Street crossing yesterday afternoon. He was badly cut about the head, but it is believed not fatally hurt. John was described as old. He was probably in his late 50s. He was also described as well-known. What was he well-known for? The article gives us the who, what, where, and when for this event. Here's a 1910 photo of the Lehigh Valley and Philadelphia and Reading Railroad train station in South Bethlehem. It's easy to see how, back then, accidents could happen with little to no safety features on railroads. John's home at the time was a 2-minute walk from where the accident happened. Perhaps he was coming home from work when the accident happened. Here's another news article about John's accident from another newspaper, The Morning Call, in Allentown, Pennsylvania. This article came out on the same day as the one in the Allentown Daily Leader on November 17, 1896. Struck by the pay car. John Spillan of South Bethlehem, a well-known shoemaker, was struck by the pay car of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad yesterday afternoon and badly injured. He was taken to St. Luke's Hospital. Now we know what he was well known for, as a shoemaker. This article gives us more description of the engine that hit him, which was called a pay car. Pay cars were an official railway car operated as a mobile bank that dispersed cash wages to railway employees. We also got more information about the location, where he was taken, and when it happened. All this information helped me tie the story together. This map shows the location of John's accident, where he lived at the time of the accident, and where the hospital was located. With the hospital so close by, that may have helped him survive the accident. The next day's news article on Wednesday in the Morning Call tells us Mr. Spillan may not recover. John Spillan, the aged South Bethlehem man who was struck by an engine on the North Penn Railroad crossing Monday afternoon, was still unconscious at St. Luke's Hospital at noon yesterday. Fears for his recovery are entertained. It's now looking like he may not recover. In yesterday's article, he was described as old. Now he's described as aged. At this point, he was still unconscious, and his recovery was questionable. Here's a photo of St. Luke's Hospital in 1894. John was there for about 3 months from November 1896 to February 1897. After being at St. Luke's for 3 months, he was transferred to the State Hospital for the Insane in Norristown, Pennsylvania, on February 19, 1897. This image of the hospital is from Wikipedia. My guess is that his injuries were so severe that he needed more care, and possibly the costs were too high to stay at St. Luke's. The state hospital was probably less expensive. Another guess why John was taken to the state hospital is that Norristown, where the hospital was located, is closer to Philadelphia, where William, my great-grandfather and John's oldest son, lived, so William could be closer to John. On John's death certificate, the doctor noted the dates he attended him. He started taking care of John on February 19, 1897, which is about 3 months after John's accident. He was at the state hospital for 9 years, 6 months, and 23 days. It breaks my heart that he spent his last decade in the state hospital for the insane, but at the same time, it's a relief knowing that he wasn't there for mental illness. To give John's life some historical context, I created this graph to show a few major world events in relation to some of John's life events. Around the time John was born, Charles Dickens published Oliver Twist. John arrived in the U.S. 8 years after the potato famine. John marries Margaret 2 years after he arrived, which was 1 year before the U.S. Civil War started. 1874 is the earliest record of John living in South Bethlehem that I have. He moved with his family 1 year after the Long Depression started. John's wife Margaret died in 1880. 5 years later, he was in prison for embezzlement. In 1886, he was released from prison, and the Statue of Liberty was unveiled. In 1896, his accident occurred, and he was in the hospital for the rest of his life. During his hospital stay, President William McKinley was assassinated. John died in the same year as the San Francisco 1906 earthquake. John saw lots of changes in his life, from horse and buggy to streetcars and railroads. He died 8 years before his grandson James served in World War I. Here's a visual of what I know of John's world in South Bethlehem. Perhaps he led a typical life in a small town in the 1800s. Everything was close by. Not shown are his work locations. I would love to know the locations of where he worked. South Bethlehem genealogy researcher Ken Rainier gave me this photo and said that John's family lived there. I met Ken through the South Bethlehem Historical Society. Through finding this photo of John's house on Google Maps, I came to understand what a humble life he must have led. Looking at this photo, it appears that where John lived is still a struggling working-class neighborhood. Years may have changed, but the character of the neighborhood remains a struggling working-class neighborhood. In March 2021, the estimated value of his house was $75,800. Here's the present-day intersection where John's accident occurred. It's now the trailhead for the South Bethlehem Greenway Rail Trail. I'm happy to see that there's now safety features where his accident occurred. Things like a pedestrian light signal and crosswalks have since been established to help avoid future accidents. I'd like to think of this as one of his legacies. In the distance, you can see the Bethlehem steel stacks. They were there at the time of John's accident. Here's a few more views of the South Bethlehem Greenway Rail Trail. The trail follows an old railroad line, and the trail is about 2.5 miles long. It's a place for people to hike, run, and bike. It's nice to see his accident site transformed into a peaceful park where people can safely enjoy nature. Here's more of John's legacy. William was John's firstborn son and was my great-grandfather. I've found many news articles of William doing community service in South Bethlehem. He was the first Grand Knight of the Knights of Columbus, which started in 1882 as a Catholic fraternal organization to help Catholic immigrants. He was the chief engineer of the South Bethlehem Fire Station. And through the 38 years he worked at the post office, he progressed from clerk to foreman to supervisor. This photo shows William and his wife Bridget surrounded by 6 of the 16 children they had. My grandfather is on the far left, standing next to his mother. John's grandson, who was my grandfather, was also often in the news for community service. James served in World War I and co-authored a history about the 103rd Trench Mortar Battery. From the newspaper articles I found, my grandfather was very involved in the world of advertising, starting in the early 1920s. I'm not sure when he retired, but I'm guessing sometime in the mid-1960s. When I started researching John, this is what I wanted to find. I found several possible birth years, but no definitive birth date. I narrowed down that he might be from County Cork, but I don't know for sure. I haven't found any information about his parents. I did find when he arrived in the U.S. through his petition for naturalization. I found his marriage certificate confirming that he was living in Philadelphia in 1860. This is what I still want to know about John. What county and town he was born in? Why he was in England before he came to the U.S. Was it just aboard a ship? Why he came to the U.S. as a minor? If any of the birth years I have are correct, then he would have been a child when the potato famine occurred between 1845 and 1849. Who his parents were, and the type of work they did. This may help me understand why John decided to come to the U.S. All his birth years have been documented differently on the official papers I've found. 1827 on the 1900 federal census, 1834 on the 1880 federal census, 1836 on his Civil War draft registration, 1837 on his death certificate, and 1842 on his petition to become a U.S. citizen. To date, I have not been able to locate John's obituary. I did find the burial removal permit for his body. It appears that his body was taken from the state hospital to Philadelphia, perhaps for his funeral, and then his body was transported to Bethlehem, where he was buried. Between this document and an old map of St. Michael's, I'm assuming he was buried at St. Michael's, but I would like to know for sure. What I know of John's wife Margaret is from her headstone. Finding stories about her would help enrich my understanding of John and his family. I'd like to extend my gratitude to all the people listed on this page who have helped me through the years with my research, from family who gave me photos to professional and hobbyist genealogists who helped me find my way. I apologize if I've inadvertently left anyone out. Thanks for watching my presentation. I hope you found John as interesting as I do.